A champion was destroyed in 93 seconds, but the moment that truly shook the arena came after the punches stopped. The young destroyer had just finished the fight, and the crowd was still roaring on its feet, while the referee was still counting. Instead of turning to his corner or celebrating with his team, he walked straight to the ropes and stared toward the front row. There, seated only a few feet away, was the aging legend whose shadow still hung over the heavyweight crown. The new winner leaned down, whispered something only that legend could hear, and what happened next froze 18,000 people in silence. It was November 22nd, 1986, and the world title was on the line in a packed arena built for nights exactly like this. The young challenger was only 20 years old, and he was about to become the youngest heavyweight champion the sport had ever seen. He had already won 27 professional fights, 26 of them by knockout, and his rise had filled the division with a deep, familiar fear. Men were stepping into the ring against him already half-beaten in their minds, already bracing for what his fists might do. And across from him stood a seasoned champion, a strong and tested fighter, the kind of man no serious observer could dismiss. That champion was not weak, not lucky, and not unworthy of the belt, but the storm came anyway, and it came fast. He was dropped twice in the second round, and on the second fall his legs betrayed him when he tried to rise. His body was doing that terrible thing bodies do when the brain can no longer send clear orders to the limbs below it. The referee began to count at 2 minutes and 35 seconds of the round, while the crowd tried to process what it had just seen. And in the front row, watching every second with uncommon focus, the old master had not missed a single detail. He had been there since before the undercard, sitting close enough to study the movement instead of merely enjoying the spectacle. He was 44 years old, and a cruel illness had already begun changing the way he moved, spoke, and held himself in public. Still, he had come because the young champion had asked him, because great boxing always pulled him near, and because he understood brilliance instantly. He watched not as a fan, but as a man who had once ruled that same world from the inside and knew its hidden language. And what he saw in those opening moments told him everything about the force exploding before him. He saw the first-round economy, the way every step had a purpose, and every punch carried the weight of the whole body. He saw the savage efficiency of a fighter reducing heavyweight boxing to its sharpest and most essential instruments. He saw the second round unfold, and he saw what happened to the champion when the attack reached its final conclusion. So when the winner did not return to his corner, but instead climbed to the second rope and came toward him, he kept watching. The new champion looked down, the old champion looked up, and every camera near ringside sensed an unexpected story had just begun. The picture was unforgettable. The young destroyer lifted above the ropes, and the aging icon seated beneath him in the first row. One man had just taken the title. The other had once defined what that title truly meant, and both seemed to know it. Reporters, photographers, and spectators close enough to see the exchange understood at once that this moment mattered more than anyone expected. The winner leaned over and spoke directly into Legend's ear, but the arena noise swallowed every word before it could escape. Later, even those who studied the footage could not agree on the exact sentence, because the real message was never only in speech. The legend listened with the face of a man hearing something he had expected, not shocked, not offended, simply receiving it. Then, with the slow care his illness demanded, he raised his right hand and held it open a few inches from the young face. He did not strike, did not flinch, and did not move the hand forward, but kept it perfectly still for 4 long seconds. Then he lowered it, and a large crowd, sensing meaning without fully understanding it, fell into that rare and uneasy silence. It was a silence of thousands realizing they were watching something important, though not yet knowing how to explain what it was. The young champion stared at the hand, then at the older man, and only after that did he climb down and walk away. He returned to his corner where his team waited, confused by the exchange they had seen but could not decode from across the ring. A towel was wrapped around his shoulders, and his trainer quickly asked what had been said there at the ropes. The new champion answered that he had declared himself the greatest now, the rightful owner of the moment and the title. When asked about the hand, he paused and said the old master had shown him what that looked like from the other side. A well-known broadcast voice at ringside mentioned the exchange on air and wished the audience could have heard what was said. He was right to feel the importance of it. Yet even perfect audio would never have captured the deepest part of the lesson. The true weight of that moment was not the sentence spoken after the knockout, but the hand held still in front of face. In less than 90 seconds after the finish, the old champion showed the new one something no trainer or film session could teach. He showed him what power looks like when it is fully possessed, fully available, and still deliberately held back. That was not the restraint of a man who lacked ability, but the restraint of a man who knew exactly what he still carried. Only someone who has owned greatness at its highest level can reveal the difference between having force and mastering its use. The new champion had just displayed the most frightening offense in the division, and the world had seen how destructive it was. Yet in 4 still seconds, the elder showed that the belt was only one part of the championship, not the whole truth of it. The deeper crown belonged to the one who understood that choosing not to use power can be the highest form of power. The young champion understood some of it at once, and his trainer understood more when he heard the explanation in the corner. The people in the first few rows knew they had seen a message travel, without sound, from one era of boxing to another. Most of the 18,000 in the arena only knew that something had passed between the two men that made the air change. Years later, in a long interview, the younger man looked back on that exchange and described it with the honesty of age. He said he was 20, had just won the world title in 93 seconds, and believed he fully understood what championship meant. Then, he said, that hand rose a few inches from his face, stayed there for 4 seconds, and changed the meaning of everything. It was not a threat, he explained, but a lesson about what it means to have speed, power, status, and complete control. When you have all of it and still choose what not to do, he said, that is the championship more than any belt. He admitted that he had been learning that lesson for decades, long after the roar of that title night had faded away. The older legend never needed to explain the moment in public, because the hand had already spoken clearly enough for both men. There's a rare kind of teaching that happens only between people who reach the highest level of the same hard craft. It needs no classroom, no schedule, and no formal passing of knowledge. Only one person who's been there and another arriving. The one who has already walked the road must be honest enough to show what greatness really costs beyond the applause and fear. The one who is coming next must be present enough to receive the truth when it appears in a form he did not expect. That night, the older champion had already traveled where the younger one was headed, and he knew what remained to be learned. The younger man had already mastered the fighting part, the violence, the speed, the damage, and the shock that breaks opponents early. But the other part lives in the narrow space between what is possible and what is chosen, and that is harder to earn. The still hand a few inches from his face was the purest version of that lesson, compressed into 4 unforgettable seconds. It said, without words, I could use this. I still possess it, and I am deciding in this moment not to use it. That choice, more than the belt-changing hands, was the fuller meaning of mastery and the truest shape of a champion. So the words at the ropes completed one transaction, the passing claim of who was greatest in that exact moment of victory. But the hand completed something deeper, a lesson that lasted not 4 seconds alone, but an entire career and all the years after. The highest form of power is not always the strike, the shout, or the proof, but the calm decision to hold strength back. That is what was given at the ropes on that November night, and that is why the moment still lives long after the bell. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs that reminder today, and tell us when you last saw real strength held in reserve. And maybe that is why this moment has never faded, even after so many louder knockouts, bigger headlines, and more dramatic title fights have come and gone. Because what people remember is not always the violence, not always the belt, and not always the roar of the crowd at the exact moment history turns. Sometimes what lasts is a quiet gesture, a still hand, a look that carries more truth than a speech ever could in a room full of noise. In that silent exchange, one era did not simply end and another begin. It paused long enough for wisdom to be passed between them. And the young champion, whether he fully knew it then or not, walked away carrying far more than gold around his waist that night. As the years moved on, the power in his fist remained unforgettable, but the meaning of that moment only grew deeper with time. Because age is a way of revealing what youth can feel, but cannot always explain when everything is still moving too fast. What seemed like a strange and unforgettable gesture in the heat of victory slowly became a lesson about control, legacy, and true command. Not the command to overwhelm another man, but the command to rule yourself when strength is fully in your hands and ready to be used. And for any person who has ever held power of any kind, that may be the hardest victory of all to achieve. That is why this story reaches beyond boxing and beyond championships, because it speaks to something people understand in every walk of life. A parent biting back anger, a leader choosing patience, a strong person refusing to humiliate someone weaker. All of it comes from the same truth. Real mastery is not proven only in action, but in the calm and disciplined choice that decides when action is not necessary. That is what made those 4 seconds so unforgettable, and that is why they still echo long after the final bell has faded into memory. The crowd saw a victory, but hidden inside it was a greater lesson about what strength becomes when wisdom finally takes hold of it. So when people think back on that night, they may remember the speed, the knockout, the title, and the rise of a terrifying new champion. But those who look closer will remember something quieter and, in many ways, even more powerful than the fight itself. They will remember a hand held still, a message sent without threat, and a truth too deep to need many words at all. And they will remember that the highest form of greatness is not just proving what you can do, but knowing exactly when not to do it. That was the real victory handed across the ropes that night, and that is why the lesson still lives on. A man was destroyed in just 93 seconds, but the most unforgettable blow of the night was never thrown. The crowd was still roaring, the referee was still counting, and the ring was still trembling from the violence that had just ended the fight. Yet the young champion did not turn to his corner, did not raise his gloves, and did not lose himself in celebration with his team. Instead, he walked straight to the ropes with a look that made the moment feel even heavier than the knockout itself. In the front row sat the aging legend, and when the new king leaned down to whisper into his ear, the entire night changed forever. It was late November of 1986, and the world heavyweight title was hanging in the bright lights of a packed Las Vegas arena. The young challenger was only 20 years old, but already he carried the terrifying aura of a man older fighters feared before the first bell even rang. He had won every professional fight before this one, almost all by knockout, and his rise had created a level of dread the division had not felt in years. Men were not only facing his fists, they were facing the dark certainty that something painful and final was coming for them. Across from him stood a real champion, strong, seasoned, and dangerous enough that no serious person believed he would simply be brushed aside. But when the storm came, it came with the kind of force that leaves memory branded into the mind. The champion was dropped twice in the second round, and the second fall was not just a knockdown, but a visible collapse of communication between body and will. He tried to rise, but his legs seemed to belong to some other broken rhythm, betraying him in front of the whole world. The referee counted while the arena buzzed in stunned disbelief, every second stretching into something almost unreal. And just beyond the ropes in the front row, the old master watched it all with the focused stillness of someone who understood every inch of what had happened. He had been there since before the undercard began, seated close enough not merely to witness the event, but to study it like a man reading a language he once spoke better than anyone alive. He was 44 years old now, and illness had already begun taking visible pieces of him, slowing movements that had once lived like lightning. Even so, he had come because great boxing still called to him, because the young destroyer had wanted him there, and because some greatness can still recognize its own reflection. He did not watch with the loose wonder of a fan, but with the inward attention of a man measuring truth against experience. What he saw in those opening moments was not hype, not noise, but something genuine and dangerous and rare. He saw the clean economy of the first round, the way every slip, every step, and every punch had purpose carved into it. He saw the young fighter move like a compact storm, every ounce of his body driving through each shot with ruthless efficiency. He saw heavyweight boxing stripped down to its sharpest essentials, with no wasted motion and no mercy hidden behind style. Then came the second round, and he watched the ending arrive with the cold certainty of a door slamming shut. So when the winner ignored his corner and climbed toward the ropes instead, the old legend kept his eyes fixed on him without blinking. It was a picture nobody there would forget. The new champion elevated on the ropes, and the old champion seated just beneath him like a living shadow from another age. One had just seized the crown, and the other had once defined what that crown meant to the entire world. Cameras turned, reporters leaned in, and the people nearest the ring felt the air shift as if the real story of the evening had only just begun. The young champion bent low and said something into the older man's ear, something no microphone could catch through the thunder of 18,000 voices. What mattered, though, was not only what was said, but what came after, because that was the part that silenced the building. The old legend listened with a face that did not show shock, anger, or surprise, but the quiet expression of someone receiving exactly what he expected to hear. Then, slowly, with the careful effort his condition now required, he lifted his right hand and held it open just inches from the young champion's face. He did not strike, did not threaten, and did not push the hand any closer, but simply held it there in perfect stillness. For 4 full seconds, the arena seemed to hang inside that gesture, unable to breathe, unable to look away, unable to understand, and yet unable to deny its meaning. Then the hand dropped, and the silence that followed fell heavier than the knockout that had brought everyone to their feet. The young champion stared first at the hand, then at the man beneath it, and something in his face suggested that he had understood more than anyone else in the building. Only then did he climb down and return to his corner, where his team waited in confusion, still trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed from across the ring. A towel was draped over his shoulders, and his trainer quickly asked what had been said there at the ropes in those strange few seconds after victory. The new champion answered that he had told the old legend he was the greatest now, that the title belonged to him, and that the moment had passed. When the trainer asked about the raised hand, the young man paused and quietly said he had just been shown what greatness looked like from the other side. A broadcaster sitting ringside mentioned the exchange on air and said he wished the audience could hear what had passed between the two champions. But even if the whole world had been given the exact words, it still would not have captured the deepest truth of that moment. The real lesson was not in the sentence spoken after the knockout, but in the open hand held just inches away and never used. In less than a minute after becoming champion, the young fighter was shown something no corner, no trainer, and no film study could have taught him. He was shown the difference between possessing power and mastering it. That hand was not the gesture of a man who lacked the ability to use it, but of a man who still understood exactly what it meant to have it. Only someone who has once lived at the absolute summit can reveal that the highest form of force is not always action, but choice. The new champion had just displayed terrifying offense, the kind that breaks bodies, weakens resolve, and makes entire divisions afraid. Yet the old champion answered that violence not with fear, not with envy, and not with words, but with restraint so complete it became its own kind of power. In those 4 still seconds, he showed that a belt can be won in a fight, but the deeper meaning of championship is earned somewhere beyond the punches. The young champion understood at least part of it right away, and his trainer began to understand it too as the explanation settled in. The people closest to the ropes knew they had seen a message pass from one era to another without ever becoming sound. Most of the arena only felt the weight of the moment without being able to name it, which somehow made it even more haunting. Many years later, the younger man would look back on that night and admit that he had thought victory itself was the whole meaning of being champion. But then a single hand rose near his face, paused in silence, and changed the shape of that meaning forever. He would later say it was not a threat, not an attempt to embarrass him, and not even a challenge to what he had just achieved. It was a lesson about what it means to have everything: speed, strength, fear, glory, and complete ability, and still choose what not to do with it. In youth, power often feels like something you prove by using, by displaying, by forcing the world to bow before it. But the older man showed him that true mastery begins when power no longer controls you, when you become the one who decides its limits. That was why the memory stayed alive in him for decades, because some lessons are not learned in a night, but carried for a lifetime. There's a rare kind of teaching that happens only between people who reach the highest level of the same hard and lonely craft. It needs no classroom, no formal invitation, and no long speech. Only one person who has already walked the road, and another who has just stepped onto it. The one who has been there must be honest enough to show the truth beneath the glory, and the one arriving must be humble enough to receive it. On that night, the older champion had already lived the burden of being feared, being crowned young, and being asked to carry more than fists can carry. So when the younger champion came to the ropes like so many young conquerors do, the old master gave him not praise, but understanding. The younger man had already mastered the fighting part, The explosions, the destruction, the speed, and the force that leave opponents broken in body and spirit. But there was another part of greatness still waiting for him, a quieter part that lives in the small space between what is possible and what is chosen. The still hand held inches from his face became the purest form of that lesson, stripped of ornament, stripped of explanation, and stripped of everything except truth. It said, without a single spoken sentence, that real command is not just the ability to act, but the wisdom to hold action back, and that, more than any belt wrapped around any waist, was the true measure of a champion. So the words exchanged at the ropes settled one thing, the simple passing claim that on that night the young champion now stood at the top. But the hands settled something far deeper, something that would outlive cheers, titles, headlines, and even the long fading of both men from the center of the sport. The highest form of power is not always the strike that lands, but the strength that remains fully available and still chooses mercy, control, or silence. That was the real gift passed across the ropes in Las Vegas, and that was why the moment refused to die with the final bell. It remained alive because a 4-second gesture said more about greatness than an entire career shouting ever could. And maybe that is why this story still moves people long after louder knockouts and bigger title nights have disappeared into history. We do not always remember the moment of violence most clearly, but the instant when wisdom rises up and stands face to face with raw power. In that silent exchange, one age of greatness did not simply give way to another, but paused long enough to pass on its deepest truth. The young champion left the ring with the belt around his waist, but he carried away something far heavier and far more valuable than gold. He carried the lesson that the greatest strength a person can show is not always what they do, but what they choose, with full power in their hands, not to do.